Module 1. Documentum Server Pre-Installation Task. Module Objective. In this module, we will be covering several key objectives that will help you prepare and execute a successful installation of the Documentum content server. Firstly, we will be looking at the disk and memory requirements necessary to support the Documentum system installation. We'll go over the minimum requirements to ensure your system can handle the demands of Documentum. Next, we will dive into identifying the hardware and software requirements necessary to install the content server. It is essential to ensure that the hardware and software are compatible with the content server to prevent issues during the installation process. We'll then move on to the setup of the database for the content server installation. This is a critical step as the content server relies heavily on the database for its operation. We'll walk you through the necessary steps to set up the database and ensure that it is optimized for the content server. One of the more important topics we will cover is the differentiation between the installation owner and the repository owner. These are two distinct roles with different sets of responsibilities. We'll go over the differences between the two and ensure that you understand what each role entails. Finally, we'll cover the establishment of the necessary accounts for the content server. This includes creating accounts for both the installation and repository owners, and any other necessary accounts to ensure the content server runs smoothly. Disk spaces requirement. There are certain minimum disk space requirements that you need to be aware of. These requirements are essential to ensure that your system runs efficiently and without any hiccups. Let me take you through them. Firstly, you need enough disk space for the operating system, the Documentum server installation, server logs, and Explore instance. The amount of space required for the operating system depends on which system you have installed. For example, Microsoft Windows 2019 64-bit requires 32 GB, while Red Hat Linux 9.1 requires 10 GB. In addition to this, you need to allocate 3 to 4 times of the total server RAM for swap space. The content server requires 40 GB of space, the content server logs require 50 MB, the index server requires 10 GB of space, and the index server temp space requires 5 GB of space. For WDK application required 4 GB of space. Server memory requirement. When planning how much memory RAM is required for each server, it is important to use the estimates below. For the content server, we recommend allocating 4 GB of RAM. For the index server, we recommend allocating 4 GB of RAM. It is recommended to allocate 3 MB of RAM for each active user session on the content server and 1 MB of RAM for each active user session on the database server. For the WDK application, it is recommended 3 MB of RAM for each active user session. After installation, it is important to monitor actual memory usage to ensure optimal performance. If you notice that your servers are running slow or experiencing other issues, it may be necessary to add more RAM to support the system's increased demand. Capacity planning resources. The System Sizing Spreadsheet, also known as the Documentum System Sizing Tool. This powerful tool is designed to help organizations optimize their Documentum system by providing a better estimate of system resources such as CPU, RAM, and disk space required for peak performance. You can find this tool on the support.opentext.com, where it is available for download. The System Sizing Spreadsheet is an Excel spreadsheet that includes web-top and D2 sizing estimates, ensuring that all aspects of the Documentum system are taken into consideration. This means that you can be confident that you are getting an accurate estimate of the resources required for your specific Documentum implementation. One of the key benefits of this tool is that it provides an accurate estimate of the system resources required for your Documentum system. by taking into account all of the different components of the system, including Documentum server, application server, content transformation server, and Explorer. It helps to ensure that there are no resource constraints that could negatively impact system performance. The system sizing tools contain 5 specific user input sections that allow for a comprehensive estimate of system requirements. These sections include general, user-specific, content-specific, customization-specific, and load-specific. Each of these sections are critical in determining the sizing requirements of the system. In the general section, users input information about the operating system, the number of processors, and the number of cores per processor. In the user-specific section, users input information about the number of users and their expected usage patterns. In the content-specific section, users input information about the types and sizes of the documents that will be stored in the system. In the customization-specific section, users input information about any customizations that will be added to the system. Finally, in the load-specific section, users input information about the expected usage load on the system. Once all the necessary information has been entered into the spreadsheet, the summary page will provide an estimate of the sizing requirements for the various components of the Documentum system. The summary will cover the sizing estimation of the database server, Documentum server, application server, content transformation server, and Explorer. The system sizing tool is an invaluable resource for organizations that want to make sure they have the correct hardware and infrastructure in place to support their Documentum system. With this tool, you accurately estimate the requirements for your system and make sure that it can handle the load placed on it. General section. Let's go over each of the parameters and their meanings. RDBMS type. This parameter refers to the type of database management system that will be used by Documentum. You can choose between Oracle or SQL Server. Deploy on virtual machines. This parameter refers to whether the Documentum application will be deployed on a virtual machine or a physical machine. You can choose yes or no depending on your deployment preference. Ratio of logical CPU cores versus real CPU cores. This parameter refers to the ratio of logical CPU cores to real CPU cores that will be used by Documentum. You can choose from the following options: 1 to 1, 1.5 to 1, 2 to 1, 2.5 to 1, or 3 to 1. Predict for next number of years. This parameter refers to the number of years you want to predict for the capacity planning of your Documentum system. You can choose a value less than 5. Use Explorer. This parameter refers to whether you will be using the Explorer search engine as part of your Documentum system. You can choose yes or no depending on your search engine preference. CPU power. This parameter refers to the processing power of the CPU that will be used by Documentum. You should enter the gigahertz value of the CPU that you plan to use. Use My Insight report. This parameter refers to whether you will be using the My Insight reporting tool for Documentum. You can choose yes or no depending on whether you plan to use this tool for capacity planning and monitoring. User-specific. Here are the parameters in the user-specific section and what they mean. Number of users. This parameter refers to the total number of users who will be using the Documentum system. Percent active users, peak rate of online users. This parameter refers to the percentage of active users who will be using the system concurrently during peak usage times. And active users are defined as users who are currently working on the system, performing transactions or workflow-related activities. Ratio of light users. This parameter refers to the ratio of users who perform light usage transactions, such as navigation and reading, compared to the total number of users. Ratio of heavy users. This parameter refers to the ratio of users who perform heavy usage transactions such as creating or modifying documents or working with workflows compared to the total number of users. Estimated % growth of users per year. This parameter refers to the expected growth rate of users in the system per year. This is an important parameter for forecasting the long-term capacity requirements of the Documentum system. Content-specific. This section includes several parameters, including document format, average size, number of existing docs, growth rate per year, request media transformation, average rendition size, and full index. Let's start by discussing the document format parameter. This parameter refers to the type of file format that your organization will be storing in Documentum. It could be anything from a PDF, Word document, Excel spreadsheet, or even media file like image and video file. The next parameter is the average size, which is measured in kilobytes. This parameter is the average file size of the documents you will be storing in Documentum. It is crucial to have an accurate average file size to determine the amount of storage space required for each document. The number of existing docs parameter refers to the total number of documents, which including the version for each document that store in Documentum. The growth rate per year parameter is essential in estimating the data size over time. This parameter helps to forecast the storage space required to accommodate your organization's future data growth. Request media transformation is another parameter to define which document format will generate the rendition by content transformation server. This parameter refers to the content transformation that will be applied to the documents, such as image or video conversion. The rendition of the document can significantly increase the size of a document, and it is essential to factor in this growth when calculating the amount of storage space required for your Documentum system. The average rendition size parameter is crucial when estimating the amount of storage space required for Documentum. Renditions refer to the various formats of a document that are stored in the system. The average rendition size is the average size of specific format of document that are stored in the system. It is crucial to have an accurate average rendition size as it is a significant factor in determining the total storage space required for your Documentum system. Lastly, the full index parameter is used to define which format of document required to build index for full text search. It is essential when estimating the storage space required for Explorer. A full text index is created for every document, and this index can take up a considerable amount of storage space. To calculate the storage space required for Documentum Content Server, you can use the following formula: number of documents times versions times average content size plus renditions. Customization specific. In this section, we will discuss the parameters that will impact the size of the database storage. The first parameter is the number of customized data types. This parameter refers to the number of custom object types that have been created to fit the specific needs of your organization. The second parameter is the average number of attributes per data type. To determine this parameter, you can run an IAPI command with count c specific object ID to count the number of attributes for each data type. It is important to know the average number of attributes per data type as it will impact the size of the database and will also affect the query performance. The third parameter is the average number of widgets in a workspace for D2 application. This parameter refers to the average number of widgets that are used in a workspace. The number of widgets in the workspace can impact the response time. Finally, the volume of customized data types is the total volume for all the objects of customized data types. This volume should have been counted in the content-specific part of the sizing spreadsheet. It is crucial to know the volume of customized data types as they will affect the overall size of the database. Load-specific. In this section, we will discuss the load-specific parameters for the D2 application. These parameters are essential in determining the required resources for the application server and content server. In this section, it required to specific the loading level for light users and heavy users for specific operations, including login, navigation, view export doc, import create, checkout, check-in, deletion, property modification, search, workflow submission, and task handling. A light user refers to a user who performs minimal operations, while a heavy user performs a more extensive set of operations. This section is used to optimize the performance of the application server and content server by determining the required resources for each operation. By measuring the loading for each operation, we can identify the bottlenecks and allocate resources accordingly. In summary, the load-specific section is essential in determining the required resources for the D2 application. By estimating the load level for specific operations, we can optimize the performance of the application server and content server and provide an efficient user experience. Additional disk space considerations. First, if you're replicating content from other repositories or other content servers in the same repository, you'll need 2 extra disk space on the content server to store the content files. This is true for both object replication and distributed content, which allows you to keep file content close to users that log into a particular content server. In addition to content replication, you'll also need to consider scratch space and audit trail entries. Scratch space is temporary disk space used for processing operations, such as during the creation of renditions. For audit trail entries, you'll need to allot space in the database to store each occurrence of an auditable event. The amount of space needed will depend on the number of attributes that the administrator chooses to store for each entry. For more information on audit trail events and entries, refer to the Content Server Administrator's Guide. By taking all of these additional considerations into account, you'll be better prepared to estimate the disk space requirements for your system. Continue with additional disk space considerations. We should consider the storage of job reports, log files, and workflow reports. These are critical pieces of information that we need to keep track of, but they can also take up a lot of disk space over time. To manage this, we should be regularly reviewing and archiving older files that are no longer needed, and consider using compression tools to reduce their overall size. Another consideration is the use of site caching services. These services can help improve the performance of our websites by storing frequently accessed data in memory or on disk, but they can also use up significant amounts of space during their execution. It's important to monitor the size of these caches and ensure that they're not consuming more resources than necessary. Finally, we need to pay close attention to the index server, which is a critical component of our infrastructure. The index server is disk I/O intensive, which means that it relies heavily on fast disk access and network connectivity to function optimally. To get the best performance out of this system, we should consider installing it on a fast disk with a quick network connection. We should also be using multiple disks or disk arrays to spread out the workload. And if we're installing the index and fixml files on separate disks, they should also be fast with a quick network connection. Documentum Server Guideline. Documentum systems architecture can be set up in different ways depending on the intended use. For development, it's possible to install all components on a single machine. However, for production environments, it's recommended to install the functional components on separate machines. These components include the database server, Documentum content server, application server, Explore server, and content transformation server. For Documentum content server, it is recommended to configure only one repository per machine. One thing to note is that the content transformation server should always be installed on a separate machine, even in a development environment. By separating the components onto different machines, it can help with scalability and overall system performance. Software requirement. The complete software requirements are detailed in the document named OpenText Documentum Platform Infrastructure Certification Guide. You can download this document from support.opentext.com. This document covers the supported environments and compatibility, as well as OpenText product compatibility. So, it is essential to refer to this document for the detailed software requirements. The specific software requirements for the lab exercise in this course are MS Windows Server 2019 for the operation system, MS SQL Server 2019 for the database server, Documentum 11.0.16 for the Java JDK, Apache Tomcat 9.0.65 for the application server, and for client browser, it required Microsoft Edge based on Chromium. It is important to notice that all components are run on a 64-bit architecture. Lab Environment Architecture. For the training purpose, we will be installing all Documentum components in a standalone environment without content transformation services. The installation of content transformation services will be covered in the D2 configuration course. To set up the lab environment, students will need to prepare a VMware instance with Windows 2019 Server installed. In this course, we will guide you through the installation steps for the other components, such as the MS SQL Database Server, OpenJDK, Documentum Server, Explorer, Composer, Process Engine, and Apache Tomcat. We will also cover the Documentum DE and Workflow Designer web application deployment. In the diagram, we have specified the default required port for each service. The Apache Tomcat runs on port 8080, the Doc Broker on port 1489, the Documentum repository services on port 47625, the Java method server on port 9080, the Explorer server on port 9300, the Explorer index agent on port 9200, and the MS SQL database on port 1433. Please note that all ports are not configured for SSL. Database setup. Throughout this course, our focus will be on the installation and configuration of MS SQL 2019. While it is worth noting that Oracle 19c and PostgreSQL 14.4 are also compatible with Documentum system, we will be specifically concentrating on MS SQL 2019. Before we commence with the installation process, I wish to remind you all that there are specific database parameters necessary for configuration. These parameters include collations. It is essential to have setting equal to SQL Latin 1 General CP 850 CSAS. Parameterization. This is highly recommended setting to be forced. Auto-create statistics. Set to be false. For auto-update statistics and auto-update statistics asynchronous. Set to be true. Read committed snapshot and allow snapshot isolation. It should be set as true. Max DOP. Recommended the setting to be 1. Moreover, I highly recommend setting the Windows environment variable of DM left outer join for ACL to true while running an MS SQL Server database. Doing so will greatly enhance the performance of the content server. Finally, as we progress through the lab of this module, we will offer an in-depth guide on the installation and configuration of MS SQL Server. User validation in the database. Firstly, when a user logs into the content server, the system utilizes the user's login and operating system password to carry out the user validation process, which means that the password policy in the operating system will also be applied with Documentum content server. Secondly, when the content server accesses the database to retrieve, update or delete data will only using the repository owner account. Furthermore, It is worth noting that the installation owner account owns all the content server processes and is also responsible for accessing the content storage file system. This means that the file system must configure the permission to access by installation owner only. Network requirements. A properly configured TCP/IP network is a prerequisite for a successful installation and implementation of Documentum system. The network must meet the following requirements. First, it must provide sufficient capacity for the number of required client connections to the server. It is important to ensure that the network can handle the expected volume of traffic without any degradation in performance. Second, the network must have sufficient bandwidth to support the transfer of content files to and from client machines to the repository. The ability to transfer large files across the network without interruption is critical for the optimal functioning of the Documentum system. If you are planning to install Documentum system in a distributed configuration, special network requirements may exist. It is recommended to review the Documentum Distributed Configuration Guide to ensure that all network requirements are met. If you are installing Documentum system on a server that uses multiple network cards, it is required to modify the docbroker.ini file by adding the line host equal to the IP address of the primary network card. The example have been added on the slide. This modification is necessary to ensure that the Documentum system processes are properly bound to the correct network card and to avoid any potential connectivity issues. Windows host requirements. It is essential to ensure that the Windows regional settings specify a 4-digit date. Verifying the regional settings beforehand will avoid any complications during the installation process. On Windows 2019, it is also important to note that if you want to authenticate users in a domain other than the host on which the content server is installed, the computer browser service must be enabled. Moving on, it is vital to determine the installation owner account. The installation owner is the user account used to install the server and create a repository. The content server runs under the installation owner's account, and the owner must have an operating system account. Furthermore, it is necessary to determine the repository owner account. The repository owner is the user account used to connect to the database and owns all the objects in the database. It is essential to note that each repository must have a unique repository owner. Lastly, it is crucial to determine the number of repository users. The number of repository users will be used to estimate the number of concurrent connections to the repository. This estimation will help determine the necessary resources for the server and avoid any potential issues during operation. The installation owner account. The installation owner account is a critical in Documentum system that is responsible for installing, configuring, and managing Documentum servers and repositories. It owns all Documentum server processes and has super user privileges for all repositories. Moreover, the installation owner account runs server setup.exe to install and set up the Documentum server files on the file system. It also owns all content files and full text indexes on the file system. It is crucial to note that there is only one installation owner account per Documentum installation. This account is a member of the local administrators group in Windows, and it is recommended to use the account name dmadmin. Additionally, it should be a separate account from the Windows administrator. The repository owner account. The repository owner account is a critical component of Documentum, and it is essential to understand its role in the system. It is recommended to use the repository name to be the same as user account name. The repository owner account is responsible for owning all tables, views, and objects associated with the repository, including all sessions started by user accounts. It is a vital aspect of our Documentum system, and without it, the system would not function correctly. It is important to note that each repository must have its own, separate repository owner account. This means that if there are two repositories using a single database, each repository must have a unique repository owner account. This is crucial to ensure that each repository is correctly managed and that data is not mixed up between different repositories. Documentum server uses this account to connect to the database. This allows the server to access the necessary data to operate the system. The account can be created automatically when installing a repository, or it can be created in advance. System account. There are several system accounts that need to be set up when configuring a Documentum system. The first is the installation owner account, which is usually set to dmadmin. The second account that needs to be set up is the repository owner account. This account is responsible for owning all tables, views, and objects associated with the repository. The default name of the repository owner is the name of the repository. The third account that needs to be set up is the global repository user account, which defaults to DMBOF registry. This account is used to manage the Documentum object framework, which is a set of APIs used to access and manipulate the Documentum repository. The fourth account is the WDK presets owner account, which defaults to DMC WDK presets owner. This account is responsible for owning all the presets configuration used by the WDK application. The fifth and final account is the WDK preference owner account, which defaults to DMC WDK preferences owner. This account is responsible for WDK application to access or change the system preferences. In addition to these system accounts, there is a role called Documentum Workflow Designer, which is usually added to dmadmin as a member. This role provides access to the Documentum Workflow Designer, which is used to create and manage workflows in the system. Documentum Server User Access. The Documentum server acts on behalf of users to complete required tasks. This means that it operates as a proxy for the users, enabling them to perform the necessary operations on the content stored in the repository. The Documentum server only allows users to gain access to content for which they have sufficient permission. This means that if a user does not have the necessary permissions to access a particular document or object, they will be denied access by the server. It is important to note that all Documentum server user sessions are owned by the installation owner. This means that the installation owner has full control over all user sessions, including the ability to terminate them if necessary. Furthermore, all database sessions are owned by the repository owner. This means that the repository owner is responsible for managing and controlling all database sessions and ensuring that they are used appropriately.